romantic novels that made her famous, and her son couldn't bear it. He knew that he had an intellect far superior to hers, which wasn't quite as negligible as many commentators would have us believe, yet he was not capable of simply dismissing her literary pretensions from his mind as beneath his consideration. This conflict evidently had to run its course in order for unfinished psychological business to be played out. But Weimar was more than just a soap opera of endless domestic tantrums for Schopenhauer. He also came to know Goethe. The budding philosopher and the mature genius would talk for hours. Schopenhauer later claimed that he profited immensely from these conversations, and also that he helped Goethe with his theory of colours. This comes as a surprise, for Schopenhauer had studied medicine and possessed a good scientific brain. Goethe's theory of colours was little more than a hobby of genius, the foible of an amateur scientist with which he would pester his admiring visitors. A century before, Newton had already explained how white light is composed of all the colours of the spectrum. Goethe obstinately refused to believe what was obvious to anyone who had seen white light pass through a prism, whose refractive power broke it down into the colours of the rainbow. In Goethe's view, white light was a colour in its own right. His theory claimed that all colours were in fact a mixture of light and darkness, permeated by a cloudy element that gave the ensuing grey dusk its coloured radiance. This nonsense was taken seriously only because of Goethe's genius in other fields, and then only by the literati and other scientific numbskulls. Schopenhauer had considerable literary skill, but certainly didn't fall into the latter category. One wonders why he was taken in. For once his arrogance seems to have failed him. This was perhaps the last time Schopenhauer allowed his ideas to be influenced by a living being whose genius he was willing to recognize. From now on, he would have sufficient self-certainty to follow his own intuition at all times, often in the teeth of prevailing contemporary opinion. Fortunately, Schopenhauer had an exceptional intellectual instinct, which enabled him to produce a philosophy that was not only original, but also uncannily prescient of intellectual developments to come, rather than the philosophical equivalent of Goethe's theory of colours, which is the usual product of a thinker who dismisses the ideas of his contemporaries with the derision he feels they deserve. The young Schopenhauer's admiration for the aging Goethe was deep and heartfelt, and though their friendship was brief, it was the only such warm relationship he was to have in his life. It is no accident that Goethe was almost exactly the same age as Schopenhauer's father would have been had he not committed suicide. Goethe's benevolent brilliance was perhaps the only foil for the austere, powerful shadow of Schopenhauer's dead father. But all this did little to improve things with mother. Goethe hardly helped matters at home when he informed Johanna Schopenhauer that her son would one day be recognized as a genius. In her view, there was room for only one of this species on the family perch, and that place was already occupied. It was also during this period that Schopenhauer discovered Indian philosophy, which, together with Plato and Kant, were to be the formative influences on his own thinking. Indian philosophy provided an intellectual justification for his deeply pessimistic view of the world. In fact, this justification was as dubious as its source. Schopenhauer read a book called Upnachat, the latest fad among the Romantics, who were willing to take up anything that set their minds free from the constraints of rationalism. The book was a translation by a Frenchman into Latin from a Persian translation from the original Sanskrit. Its fidelity to the original text is perhaps best illustrated by the closeness of its title, Upnachat, to what we now call the original, the Upanishads. It is ironic that Schopenhauer's questionable use of this questionable text was to provide a solid foundation for modern philosophic pessimism, a strain of thought that remains firmly with us to this day. In the end, the Sturm und Drang, everyday romanticism, in the Schopenhauer household came to a peak, and Arthur slammed his last door. In May 1814, he left Weimar forever. He was never to see his mother again, though she continued to correspond with him sporadically during her coming period of literary stardom. "You are unbearable and burdensome," etc. For the next few years, Schopenhauer lived in Dresden. Here he wrote the 1,000-page The World as Will and Representation, his greatest work. He saw this work as his solution to the riddle of the world. Since the very beginning of philosophy, such an aim would have been viewed as laudable, an incontrovertible foundation on which to build one's philosophy. But it's worth noting that Schopenhauer's starting point is by no means necessary, in the logical sense. That is, it is not inevitable. How come? Well, what precisely is this riddle? If one confronts the world as a riddle, viewing it as an enigma, a puzzle to be solved, a mystery to be uncovered, and so forth, then there must be an answer. A question, or riddle, implies an answer. But there is in fact no logical reason why we should seek to question the world in Schopenhauer's way. There are many other attitudes we might adopt: rage, acceptance, despair, and so forth. Plato, who was a major influence on Schopenhauer, famously claimed that philosophy begins in wonder. This wonder is open to two interpretations: wonder as awe and wonder as why. Plato seems to have intended the former, but philosophy, before and since, has emphasized the latter. Not until the 20th century was this attitude questioned, when philosophy came to regard itself as an activity rather than a search for the truth. Schopenhauer certainly viewed his philosophy as the latter, or at least as a significant step along the true path to the latter. As he put it, this philosophy will in future be perfected, worked out more accurately and finely, made more readily comprehensible and easier, but it will never be overthrown. Philosophy will exist. The history of philosophy will be concluded. Philosophers will eventually arrive at the truth, and the riddle will be solved. Ironically, it was Schopenhauer who was to a considerable extent responsible for the undermining of this point of view. His wholly original way of viewing the world was the first step along the path in the other direction, though he was unaware that he was taking this momentous step. Instead of viewing the world with awe, Schopenhauer viewed it with disgust. Medieval philosophers had often viewed the world as a pretty base affair, a theatre of folly and evil, no less. But there always remained an element of redeeming grace. The world itself may have been base, but the overall scheme of things was presided over by a God who was good. When Schopenhauer saw the world as evil, he meant that the entire scheme of things was evil, utterly devoid of any redeeming feature. In choosing to regard the world as evil rather than good, Schopenhauer had inadvertently undermined the necessity of his own position. Later philosophers, especially Nietzsche and Wittgenstein, would realize this. Schopenhauer's attitude toward the world was contingent, that is, not logically necessary. Philosophy could adopt any number of attitudes toward the world. Viewing it as a riddle was only one of many possible responses, and all were contingent. Schopenhauer's The World as Will and Representation is prefaced, curiously, with a quotation from Rousseau. Sans l'enfance, ami, réveille-toi. In effect, grow up and come to your senses, my friend. The fundamental idea of this mammoth book is deftly summed up in its title, which is sometimes misleadingly translated as The World as Will and Idea. The world we see consists of representation, mere phenomena, very much as Kant described it, but what supports this representation is not the ultimate reality of noumena, the thing in itself, as in Kant. Instead, the entire phenomenal facade of the world, the phenomena we experience, is supported by the universal will. This will is blind, permeates all things, and is eternally without purpose. Like Kant's noumena, it is beyond space and time and has no cause. It is this will that brings about all the misery and suffering of the world, which can only end in death. Our only hope is to liberate ourselves from the power of this will and the trappings of individuality and egoism that are at its mercy. This can only be done by selflessness expressed in compassion for our fellow sufferers, by abnegation of the will as practiced by saints and ascetics of all races and creeds, and by aesthetic appreciation of works of art, which involves will-less contemplation. In his earliest mature work, The Fourfold Root of the Principle of Sufficient Reason, Schopenhauer had argued that our perception creates the world according to the four types of cause and effect. These are logical, physical, mathematical, and moral, and all conform to the principle of sufficient reason. Schopenhauer adopted the principle of sufficient reason wholesale, from its 18th-century rationalist originator Gottfried Leibniz, the first of the great German philosophers. Leibniz defined his principle: every fact which is true or existent, and any principle which is true, is dependent upon a sufficient reason for its being so, and not otherwise, even though most of the time we cannot know these reasons. In other words, everything has a reason for its existence, for existing as it is, and not otherwise. Schopenhauer may have taken over this principle from Leibniz, but this didn't prevent him from castigating its originator for not understanding it properly. Schopenhauer points out that Leibniz had not clearly distinguished between various causes and effects, which Schopenhauer divided into his 4 types. Logical causes give a priori effects. That is, these are true prior to experience and are in no way dependent upon it. For example, the statement, "An octopus has 8 legs." Physical causes, on the other hand, explain changes that take place in the physical world, for example, lightning, carbonized rabbit. Mathematical causes produce geometrical proofs. This is clear to us every time we rely upon 2 + 2 = 4 to prove that mathematical space can have 10 dimensions. And moral causes provide the motives for our actions. Action, son's unreasonable behavior at home. Motive, jealousy of mother's literary success, hypocritical disapproval of her lax moral behavior, insufficient admiration for aforesaid son's philosophic genius, etc. Schopenhauer stresses that all these causes and effects belong to and operate solely within the phenomenal world. The noumenal world, the Kantian world of the thing in itself that supports this phenomenal world, which for Schopenhauer is replaced by the will, does not take part in this chain of cause and effect. Causation can apply only in the world we experience. The will does not act as a causative agent. Schopenhauer supports this surprising claim with a powerful argument. He claims that we all have access to this world beyond the phenomenal world, where the will operates in its ghostly fashion. This happens when we seek to know ourselves. In the ordinary course of events, we perceive ourselves just as we perceive the phenomena of the outer world. These are external perceptions, but we are also aware of ourselves from within. On such occasions, we are aware of ourselves as participating in the will. On the one hand, we can perceive ourselves operating in the physical world of cause and effect, but we also intuit and are aware of the will within us. This we may glimpse as the will to life, whose ghastly presence informs all our actions. Schopenhauer argues that this does not directly cause our actions, it somehow underlies them. As a piece of rational philosophical argument, this may not appear particularly convincing. It was, however, a deep and perceptive outline of human action, one that was way ahead of its time. As a tentative description of how the unconscious works, it immediately becomes much more convincing. Although we can be aware of our actions on these 2 levels, act, will, it is difficult to separate the 2. Schopenhauer views the will as a universal force that supports or irradiates all phenomena. As individuals, we are merely a tiny part of this all-embracing, blind will. At this point, Schopenhauer's argument faces an obvious objection. We may be aware of a will operating within us, yet most of us would probably describe this as individual willpower rather than participation in some universal force. This is how we apprehend it, or are aware of it. Even those who might see this will as part of a collective unconscious would find it difficult to enlarge this collective to include all that is embraced by Schopenhauer's transcendental, universe-permeating will. But philosophy is not a democratic process, any more than science is. Just because most of us once believed that the Earth was the center of the universe did not make it so. Likewise, just because most of us vaguely apprehended the will within us as individual, rather than the will, does not defeat Schopenhauer's argument. Countless vague individual perceptions can sometimes be swept aside by just one vision of Copernican sweep and clarity. To illustrate, just a year before Schopenhauer's death, there appeared a scientific idea that would change the world forever. This was an idea that has arguably transformed our view of ourselves more than any idea before or since. In 1859, Charles Darwin published his Origin of Species, showing how all living species had evolved according to the survival of the fittest. Much profound historical and contemporary thinking could not survive the emergence of this idea. Religion, philosophy, culture, even civilization, all